Have you ever felt a quiet, simmering resentment toward the world? A feeling that life has somehow worn you down? It's not a fiery, explosive anger, but something more subtle, more pervasive. It's the low-grade irritation that hooks you when someone cuts you off in traffic, the quiet sigh when a friend cancels plans again, the cynical thought that creeps in during a moment of potential joy. On the surface you're fine. You smile, you show up, you do everything you're supposed to do. But underneath that carefully constructed exterior, there's a quiet bitterness, a hardened layer around your heart. And perhaps the most unsettling part of it all is that you don't even know where it began. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung believed that this state was not merely a personal failing or a bad mood. It was a profound psychological and even spiritual condition. In our journey today, we will explore the hidden reason why so many people live bitter, quietly empty lives without ever realizing the true source of their discontent. It's not because they are bad people, and it's not because they have failed. It is because something deep inside them was wounded long ago and was never allowed to heal. To understand this, we must be willing to go there deep into the shadows of the psyche, to the grieving inner child, and ultimately, to the path that leads back to wholeness. Most people who live in a state of chronic bitterness have no idea that their condition rarely stems from what's happening in their present life. Instead, it's an echo, a ghost from the past. It's the byproduct of something old, unresolved, and buried deep within the vast, subterranean landscape of the unconscious mind. Jung's depth psychology proposes that bitterness is almost never a conscious emotional choice. Rather, it is the natural, toxic byproduct of unprocessed inner wounds, especially those that have been repressed and ignored for years, or even decades. Bitterness is not always loud. It doesn't always belong to the person who screams in rage or aggressively sabotages others. In fact, some of the most bitter people are the most silent. They carry an internal heaviness, a certain flavor of cynicism that colors their every interaction. They wear their weariness like a heavy coat and maintain a subtle, stubborn refusal to fully trust life or the people in it. They might hold stable jobs, smile politely at parties, and maintain surface-level relationships, but there is an impenetrable shell around their hearts. It's a protective layer of distrust that unconsciously repels genuine intimacy, a sense of purpose, and spontaneous joy. According to Jung, so much of our emotional life operates far beyond the narrow field of our conscious awareness. The ego, that part of our mind we identify with as I, is only a tiny, fragile island in the vast ocean of the total psyche. The unconscious, by contrast, holds everything we've ever ignored, suppressed, denied, or were simply too afraid to face. Bitterness almost always finds its roots there, in the forgotten trenches of the psyche, in moments of profound betrayal, neglect, humiliation, or failure that were never properly processed, mourned, and integrated. One of Jung's most crucial insights is that what we fail to make conscious will not simply go away. It will come back to us as fate. People who live in a state of chronic bitterness are often caught in bewildering, repeating cycles of disappointment. They seem to attract the same kinds of betrayals: friends who let them down in familiar ways, partners who prove to be emotionally unavailable again and again, careers that promise fulfillment but always fall short. To the untrained eye, this looks like a string of terrible luck. But Jung would argue that these are not coincidences. They are psychic feedback loops, patterns created and sustained by the unresolved emotional material in the unconscious. The wound, left unhealed, sends out a homing signal, unconsciously seeking out situations that feel familiar, hoping, in a strange way, to finally resolve the original trauma. At some point in a person's life, something hurt them deeply, and they were either too young, too overwhelmed, or too unequipped to handle it consciously. That immense pain went underground. It didn't disappear, it calcified. It hardened into resentment. And to protect themselves from ever being that vulnerable and hurt again, they began to see the world through a filtered lens. A lens colored by suspicion, blame, and a deeply ingrained pessimism. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes absolutely critical. The shadow is the part of our psyche that holds all the aspects of ourselves that we reject or deny. Our weakness, our rage, our envy, our shame. Most bitter people are carrying massive, unintegrated shadows. They cannot admit to themselves that they once felt powerless, terrified, or unloved. They refuse to acknowledge the deep humiliation they endured, or the profound longing for connection they still carry. So, they push those vulnerable feelings into the shadow and let the bitterness speak for them instead. What happens then is a psychological sleight of hand called projection. Instead of recognizing the origin of their pain within, they see it everywhere outside of themselves. They conclude that the world is a cruel place, that people are fundamentally untrustworthy, that nothing ever works out for them. But this perception is not objective reality. It is a mirror. It perfectly reflects their own inner woundedness. And because they haven't made peace with their own shadow, the world appears to confirm their bitter world. You again and again. This cycle is intensified by what Freud first termed repetition compulsion, an idea deeply compatible with Jungian analysis. It's the unconscious drive to recreate the original trauma in new situations, hoping against hope to finally achieve a different outcome and resolve the pain. A bitter person might unconsciously and repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners because, deep down, a younger part of them is still desperately trying to prove that they are, in fact, lovable. But when the pattern inevitably repeats, it only deepens the bitterness. The wound grows larger, and the internal story becomes more entrenched. See, I knew this would happen. People always let me down. Jung believed that one of the reasons bitterness is so psychologically toxic is that it stagnates our growth. It freezes a person at a particular emotional age. You might meet someone who is 45 years old, but when you observe their emotional reactions, you realize they are still operating from the psychological framework of a deeply hurt 10-year-old. That 10-year-old felt abandoned, misunderstood, or shamed, and because that formative experience was never healed and integrated, it became the emotional epicenter of the adult's personality. Bitterness also completely distorts the timeline of the psyche. A person stuck in bitterness doesn't truly live in the present. They exist in a never-ending loop of past disappointments. Every new experience is interpreted through that old, murky lens. Even joyful moments are met with suspicion. If someone is unexpectedly kind to them, their first thought might be, "What do they want from me?" If a wonderful opportunity arises, they might immediately assume, "It's too good to be true." This isn't wisdom, it's trauma masquerading as insight. One of the most difficult truths to accept from a Jungian perspective is that bitterness often becomes a core part of the ego's identity. The person begins to cling to it. It gives them a perverse sense of righteousness, a feeling of moral superiority. "I've been through more than others." They might tell themselves, "I know better." But in truth, what they know better is pain. They have become loyal to their own suffering. Jung referred to this as identification with the wound. It's a state where someone becomes so profoundly attached to their trauma that they use it to define their entire sense of self. This identification can feel strangely empowering at first. It can make a person feel deep, wise, or special. But over time, it creates profound and unbearable isolation. People eventually stop wanting to be around them because the bitterness becomes contagious. They drain the joy from a room, challenge every positive interpretation with a dose of cynicism, and shut down every possibility with phrases like, "That will never work," or "Don't get your hopes up." What they are really doing is protecting their fragile inner wound, but they do so at the cost of all genuine human connection. In many cases, bitterness is also a direct symptom of betrayal. Betrayal, especially by someone we loved and trusted, can shatter the very structure of the psyche. Jung wrote that betrayal doesn't just break the heart, it fragments the self. A child who was abandoned by a parent, a partner who was cheated on, a dreamer whose vision was cruelly ridiculed, all carry within them the potent seed of bitterness if that initial betrayal isn't fully acknowledged, mourned, and healed. Healing, however, requires turning inward. Jung was adamant that healing does not come from blaming the world. It comes from making the unconscious conscious. The person must be willing to look at the story they've been telling themselves for years and ask, with radical honesty, is this story really true? Or is this a protective narrative I've constructed to avoid feeling something deeper, something more vulnerable? This kind of self-inquiry is not easy. It demands immense emotional courage. Jung believed that the first step toward wholeness is to face the shadow. And for the bitter person, that means recognizing their own contributions to their suffering, not to blame themselves, but to reclaim their power. As long as someone believes their bitterness is caused entirely by external events, they remain a perpetual victim. But once they can see the role of their own unresolved emotions in creating their reality, they finally have a choice. Another important Jungian insight is the idea of archetypes. Many bitter people have unconsciously fallen into the archetype of the wounded martyr or the betrayed innocent. They believe the world has fundamentally wronged them, and they must carry their pain like a banner as proof of their depth and suffering. This becomes a form of psychological possession. The archetype takes over the ego and dictates their behavior. The person doesn't know they've been taken over. They simply say, "This is just who I am." But archetypes are not prisons, they are invitations. Jung would argue that being caught in a wounded archetype is a powerful signal that a deeper transformation is possible. It suggests that the bitterness, when finally faced and processed, can be alchemized into wisdom. It means that the very wound which caused the suffering can become the source of one's greatest personal power, if it is integrated properly. This is not just intellectual work. It is emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. It requires confronting grief, rage, disappointment, and shame head-on. It often requires dedicated practices like therapy, dream journaling, or spiritual exploration. But the reward is immeasurable. The lifting of a lifelong emotional fog, a return to hope, and a renewal of trust, not necessarily in other people, but in the resilience and wisdom of the inner self. Many people fear this process because they believe that facing their pain will finally break them. But Jung taught that what we fear facing most is usually the key to our liberation. Bitterness is not the end of the story. It is a signal, a psychological symptom pointing to something deeper within that longs to be seen and healed. The tragedy is not that people become bitter. That is a human response to pain. The real tragedy is that they live and die bitter, never realizing that their suffering was not a meaningless punishment, but a profound invitation to their own healing. Part 2. The shadow self, how repressed emotions become bitterness. Bitterness is not merely a simple reaction to external events. It is a direct manifestation of an inner life that has been left unacknowledged. In Carl Jung's framework of depth psychology, this pervasive emotional state often emerges not from what happens to a person, but from what happens within them, and more importantly, what they steadfastly refuse to look at. The concept of the shadow self is absolutely central to this process. The shadow is the psychic container of everything within us that our conscious ego deems unacceptable. And when that container overflows with years of unresolved emotional material, bitterness becomes the visible, toxic result. The shadow itself isn't evil, it's fundamentally human. It holds all the emotions and traits that our society, parents, religion, and culture taught us were wrong or shameful. Think of it as the dark basement of your psyche. Down there, you'll find your unexpressed anger, your secret jealousy, your unacceptable selfishness, your hidden hatred, your lust, your laziness, and your deepest insecurities. We all have a shadow. But Jung warned with great urgency that what we repress does not simply disappear. It waits, it watches, and it inevitably resurfaces, often in distorted and destructive ways, when we least expect it. A great many people live in a state of chronic bitterness precisely because they have repressed vital, life-giving parts of themselves. They never allow themselves to fully feel their grief over a loss, so that raw sadness slowly transforms and hardens into a protective shell of cynicism. They suppress their righteous rage at an injustice, so it mutates and seeps out as biting sarcasm. They stifle their profound fear of failure, so it reemerges as harsh judgment of others who dare to try. These powerful emotional energies, when they are not consciously felt, honored, and integrated, do not simply fade away. They metastasize, and over time, they begin to contaminate a person's entire perception, behavior, and world. One of the greatest dangers of repressed emotion is the psychological mechanism of projection. Jung believed projection is the primary way the shadow reveals itself to us. What this means in practice is simple but deeply unsettling. We often despise in others what we cannot accept in ourselves. The chronically bitter person is typically someone who sees injustice, failure, hypocrisy, and selfishness everywhere they look. They are hyper-vigilant to the flaws of the world, but they are completely blind to how those very same traits might be living, unacknowledged, inside of them. This kind of blindness is not intellectual, it's emotional. It's not that they don't know on some level that they carry unresolved anger or shame. It's that they actively refuse to know. The ego, in its desperate attempt to preserve a positive and consistent self-image, pushes the uncomfortable truth out of consciousness. The ego would rather see the entire world as broken than have to face the vulnerable truth. I am hurting deeply, and I am terrified to face it. Bitterness, then, becomes a form of psychological camouflage. It's a brilliant, if destructive, defense. It allows a person to remain perpetually angry without ever having to touch the profound vulnerability that lies beneath that anger. It allows them to criticize the world endlessly without ever having to confront their own flaws. It allows them to harden their heart against future pain without ever having to heal the original wound. But this hardening comes at an immense cost. When we deny our shadow, it gains power over us. What we most resist in ourselves inevitably becomes the very thing that controls us. Think of someone you know who is relentlessly critical of others. who always finds something wrong with every person they meet, every idea presented, every movie they watch. On the surface, this might seem like arrogance or simple perfectionism, but from a Jungian perspective, it's often a desperate cry for help. That person may be deeply insecure, wounded by years of rejection or emotional neglect. But instead of facing the pain of their own perceived inadequacy, they create an armor of bitter judgment. If I tear you down first, their unconscious whispers, then you can't hurt me. Jung pointed out that the shadow is most dangerous when it's completely ignored. When someone says, "I'm not angry, I just don't trust people," they are inadvertently revealing their shadow. When they insist, "I'm not being negative, I'm just being realistic," they may be masking a deep, stagnant well of disappointment. These rationalizations are the ego's clever way of maintaining a sense of control. But the deeper the denial, the more bitter and constricted the inner life becomes. Why do people repress these powerful emotions in the first place? Because the original feelings were often too painful or too dangerous to express at the time they first occurred. A young child who felt abandoned by a caregiver might have learned that crying only leads to more rejection, so they decided it's safer never to show sadness. A teenager who was cruelly humiliated in front of their peers might have vowed in that moment never to be vulnerable again. Over time, these survival decisions become subconscious programs, unseen rules the person lives by without ever realizing it. And when life fails to offer a profound healing experience or a new sense of meaning, those rules turn into walls. The walls become habits, and eventually the habits become identity. The person no longer just feels bitter, they become bitter. Their personality contracts, they stop trusting, they stop risking, they stop loving. They protect themselves from the possibility of future disappointment by rejecting hope altogether. This is not who they truly are. It's who they became in response to unacknowledged pain. Jung believed that every human being must, at some point, confront their shadow if they want to become a whole, integrated person. This confrontation is not about condemning oneself or wallowing in self-hatred. It's about reclaiming the lost and exiled parts of the psyche. The bitterness itself is a signal, a flashing red light on the dashboard of the soul, indicating that something vital in the person has gone missing, often their capacity for vulnerability, softness, trust, or spontaneous joy. To retrieve these lost qualities, they must be willing to journey back through the dark tunnel of repressed emotion and finally feel what they never wanted to feel. But this is far easier said than done. To bring the shadow into consciousness is terrifying. It means facing the parts of ourselves that we are most ashamed of. It means admitting, "I'm not as in control as I pretend to be." It means grieving sometimes for entire childhoods lost, for dreams that were abandoned, for a love that was never safe. It means surrendering the ego's desperate need to be right and opening to the deeper, more humbling truth that healing does not come through blame, but through courageous self-awareness. One reason people resist this process so fiercely is that our modern culture often does not reward emotional honesty. We are taught to move on, to stay strong, to not dwell on the past. But from a Jungian viewpoint, bitterness is precisely what happens when we skip the grief stage. It is frozen mourning. It is grief that had nowhere to go, so it turned inward and became poison. A person who has never properly mourned their suffering is like a well that's been contaminated at its source. Every thought, every feeling they draw from it will taste bitter, even when the outer circumstances of their life change for the better. To make matters even more complex, The shadow is often protected by what psychologists call secondary emotions. These are emotions that feel safer to express than the primary, more vulnerable pain that lies underneath. For example, rage often serves as a protective shield for profound grief. A need for control often hides a deep-seated fear. Bitterness, then, might be a lifelong mask for a deep, unbearable sadness, a sadness that the world was not what it promised to be, a sadness that they were never fully loved, understood, or held in a way that felt safe. When people live with that kind of foundational sorrow for years, it becomes embedded in their psychic fabric, and unless it is gently and courageously pulled apart, it will continue to manifest as bitterness in every domain of their life. In romantic relationships, shadow-driven bitterness creates a pattern of self-sabotage. The person might push love away just before it gets too close. They might unconsciously test their partners, provoke fights, or withhold affection, not because they don't want connection, but because they are terrified of the potential pain of losing it. This creates a tragic cycle where the very thing they long for, intimacy, is systematically destroyed by the bitterness that was originally meant to protect them. In their careers, this bitterness manifests as cynicism. The person might belittle their coworkers, mock the company's goals, or resist any opportunity for growth, not because they don't want to succeed, but because deep down they carry a core belief that they never will. Bitterness becomes a way to preempt disappointment. If you expect nothing, the shadow argues, you can't be let down. But in doing so, they also block themselves from ever experiencing any kind of authentic satisfaction or achievement. Even in spirituality, the shadow can hide in plain sight. People who consider themselves enlightened or above the drama may still carry a deep well of bitterness. It might show up as subtle judgment toward others, a rigid adherence to beliefs, or a quiet, spiritual arrogance. Jung warned that spiritual bypassing is one of most insidious ways the shadow survives. We use high-minded language to cover up low-vibration wounds. We talk about peace while actively suppressing our rage. We preach compassion while secretly resenting the people in our lives we have never truly forgiven. The only true antidote to this pervasive bitterness is radical self-inquiry, the kind that looks not at the behavior of others, but at the inner state that keeps creating the same painful patterns. It's the kind of inquiry that asks the brave questions. What part of me have I abandoned in the name of being safe? What feelings have I buried so deep that I can't even name them anymore? These questions don't yield easy answers, but they open the door to genuine transformation. Jung believed that every emotion, no matter how dark, carries a message. Bitterness, too, has something to teach us. It is not the enemy, it is the messenger. It tells us exactly where we are still bleeding. It shows us precisely what needs to be integrated. When we learn to honor it, not by indulging it, but by courageously understanding its origins, we begin the sacred process of reclaiming a lost piece of ourselves. Ultimately, the shadow is not something to be destroyed. It is something to be befriended. When we finally turn and face the parts of ourselves we once rejected, they stop attacking us from the inside. The bitterness begins to soften, the projections start to dissolve, and the heart, after a long and cold winter, slowly begins to reopen, not because the world has suddenly become a safer place, but because we have finally become stronger, more whole, and more compassionate within ourselves. Part 3. The projection mechanism blaming the world for inner wounds. One of the most powerful and transformative insights Carl Jung contributed to modern psychology is the concept of psychological projection. This is the unconscious process by which we take our own unwanted emotions, our unacknowledged character traits, or our unhealed wounds, and attribute them to other people. Bitterness, especially the chronic, lingering kind that seems to lack a clear explanation, is very often the direct product of this hidden, powerful mechanism. The person experiencing it doesn't recognize the true source of their emotional pain within themselves, so instead they assign it outward onto their spouse, their boss, their friends, political institutions, and even onto life itself. It becomes far easier and less vulnerable to say, "The world is cruel," than it is to say, "I am carrying a wound I've never fully acknowledged." In Jungian terms, projection is one of the primary ways the unconscious communicates with us, especially when we are unwilling or unable to face what's really going on inside. The psyche, in its infinite wisdom, pushes what is ignored internally to the outside so that we can see it more clearly. If someone carries a deep sense of shame but refuses to feel it, they might begin to perceive everyone else as being judgmental and critical of them. If they've repressed their natural envy, they may constantly accuse others of trying to show off or rub their success in their face. Bitterness builds this way, one thin layer at a time, until a person's entire world becomes tinted with suspicion, resentment, and a profound mistrust of life. This phenomenon is not about conscious lying or intentional deceit. People who live in a state of bitterness and consistently blame others for their unhappiness are not necessarily being dishonest. They are being unconscious. That is precisely what makes projection so insidious and dangerous. It feels true. It feels real. The bitter person genuinely and passionately believes the world has wronged them, that people are inherently selfish, and that life is fundamentally unfair. And while these conclusions may contain partial truths, they are not objective assessments of reality. They are distorted reflections of an inner turmoil that has been disowned. The deeper issue, according to Jung, is that this constant projection keeps us psychologically stuck. When we project, we lose the ability to see situations and people clearly. Every person we meet becomes a blank screen onto which we throw the grainy, distorted film of our own fears, disappointments, and unresolved grief. The spouse becomes cold and distant because we've never confronted our own deep-seated fear of intimacy. The boss becomes a controlling tyrant because we've repressed our own desire to lead and be powerful. The friend becomes selfish and inconsiderate because we've never learned to admit or voice our own needs. This cycle relentlessly feeds bitterness because it externalizes all responsibility. The person never has to look inward. They never have to ask the difficult, transformative question, "Why do I feel this way?" They ask instead the easier, more self-righteous question, "Who did this to me?" And the moment that question becomes a habitual way of interpreting the world, any chance for genuine healing is postponed indefinitely. Projection also leads directly to a state of chronic victimhood. The bitter person may not even realize they've come to identify so strongly as a victim, but the signs are unmistakable. They tend to speak in dramatic absolutes. "People always let me down. Nothing ever works out for me. I can't trust anyone." These sweeping statements are rarely based on the reality of the present moment. They are emotionally charged conclusions based on the wounds of the past. But because the person has never learned to distinguish the past from the present, they carry forward the same painful emotional reactions again and again, finding evidence for their victimhood wherever they look. Jung warned that this process of projection ultimately cuts us off from our own power. When we believe the source of our pain lies exclusively outside of ourselves, we surrender the ability to change our experience. We become passive waiters. We wait for the world to apologize. We wait for others to change their behavior. We wait for life to finally give us what we believe we are owed. But the profound truth is that this waiting is futile. Projection creates a powerful illusion of clarity, while simultaneously blinding us to the one thing that truly needs our attention: ourselves. Let's consider a practical example. Suppose someone grew up in a household where love and approval were conditional. They were only praised when they succeeded and were ignored or punished when they failed. As an adult, this person might carry a deep, underlying sense of worthlessness. But instead of recognizing and healing this painful inner narrative, they might begin to develop a bitter resentment toward their successful peers. They might say things like, "They think they're better than everyone else," or "They probably had everything handed to them." In reality, they are the ones who feel inferior, and their bitterness is a desperate attempt to escape that painful feeling by projecting it outward. Their resentment is not truly toward the other person. It's a displaced anger toward their own unhealed wound. Projection is also so insidious because it appears to generate its own real-world evidence. Once you begin to project bitterness onto the world, you will start to see bitterness everywhere. Someone frowns at you in the grocery store, and your mind doesn't just register it as a neutral event. It immediately concludes, "People are so rude and unhappy." A coworker forgets to invite you to lunch, and your internal story isn't, "They probably just forgot." It's a much more painful, "They don't respect me." The world becomes a perfect, unending mirror of your unconscious wound. It consistently reflects back to you what you have not yet healed within yourself. In this way, projection creates a tragic, self-reinforcing loop. The more you believe the world is out to hurt you, the more reasons you will find to believe it. And the more reasons you find, the deeper and more justified your bitterness becomes. This isn't paranoia. It is unexamined pain manifesting as perception. Jung would say that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What makes breaking this cycle even more challenging is that our projections can sometimes be partly true. People do disappoint. Life is unfair at times. There is cruelty, betrayal, and loss in the world. The external event might be real. But what Jung invites us to ask is this: why am I reacting so strongly to this particular situation? What is this intense emotion really about? If the intensity of your response far outweighs the actual event, it is a clear sign that something much deeper, something older, is being touched. This emotional overreaction is one of the clearest markers of projection. When someone becomes excessively bitter about a minor slight, a forgotten phone call, a perceived tone of disrespect, a differing opinion, it's rarely about the incident itself. It is about the powerful, symbolic meaning their unconscious has assigned to that incident. And that meaning almost always comes from the unhealed past. To reverse this process and dissolve the bitterness, one must be willing to turn inward. Jung called this courageous act the withdrawal of projections. It requires the immense strength to pause in the heat of a reaction and say, "Wait, maybe what I'm seeing in this other person is really about me." This is not about blaming yourself or letting others off the hook for their behavior. It is about reclaiming the parts of yourself that you have disowned and cast out into the world. Instead of saying, "People always betray me," you begin to say, "I carry a deep and unhealed fear of being betrayed, and it's being triggered right now." That simple but profound shift in language is the beginning of true transformation. It also requires a deep sense of humility. The bitter person often clings tightly to their stories of being wronged because those stories serve a protective function. If you've been deeply hurt and have never healed, it can feel strangely empowering to blame others. It creates a sense of moral superiority. But superiority is not healing. It's just another form of armor. And as Jung teaches, true healing only begins when that armor is finally, voluntarily, laid down. Projection is not just limited to individuals. It also exists on the collective level. Whole groups, communities, and even entire cultures can project their disowned qualities onto others. This is the psychological root of racism, classism, and political scapegoating. A society that is unwilling to face its own shadow will inevitably invent enemies to carry that shadow for them. In this sense, bitterness can become a cultural disease, spreading through social narratives that relentlessly blame the other, instead of encouraging collective inner reflection. But returning to the personal realm, the transformative question becomes, what am I projecting, and how is that projection feeding my bitterness? You may begin to find that much of what you resent most in others is something unresolved in you. The coworker who infuriates you with their arrogance might be reminding you of a time when you were shamed or punished for being confident. The partner who never listens might be reflecting your own unheard inner child. The friend who seems too happy might be triggering your own deep, suppressed grief. These patterns are not your flaws. They are your invitations. They are the psyche's way of showing you exactly what needs healing. To take this journey, Jung recommended deep inner work, dream analysis, active imagination, journaling, and often, psychotherapy. These are powerful tools to access the unconscious and retrieve the vast amounts of psychic energy that are bound up in our projections. Because that's what bitterness is at its core, trapped psychic energy. It is energy that, once reclaimed, can be used for creativity, connection, purpose, and joy. The final, compassionate insight here is that projection isn't a mistake. It's a mechanism for survival. It was the best your psyche could do at the time to protect you from overwhelming pain. But what once protected you can now be limiting you. The bitterness that was once a shield has now, over time, become a prison. And the key to your escape is not out there. It is, and always has been, within. Part 4. The persona trap bitterness behind the social mask. Carl Jung introduced the powerful concept of the persona, which he described as the social mask we all wear to adapt to the demands and expectations of society. It is a psychological construct we carefully build to present ourselves in ways that are deemed acceptable, likable, successful, or moral. While the persona is a necessary and healthy tool for social functioning, allowing us to navigate different roles at work, with family, and in public, Jung warned that identifying too closely with it leads to a deep and painful psychic distortion. For individuals living with chronic bitterness, this distortion becomes a hidden, suffocating trap. They wear a well-constructed, often charming mask for the world. The friendly neighbor, the productive colleague, the humorous friend, while beneath it simmers a vast, unexpressed reservoir of rage, sadness, and profound disappointment. This is not simple hypocrisy. It is a deep, seated strategy for psychological survival. Most people are not conscious deceivers. They don't wake up in the morning and choose to be fake. They simply learn, often very early in life, that certain authentic emotions are unsafe to express. They internalize the message that to be good or lovable means being agreeable, composed, positive, and in control. So, They meticulously build a persona that reflects these socially acceptable traits and learn to hide everything else. Their vulnerability, their anger, their confusion, their messy, authentic selves. Over time, this facade becomes so practiced, so automatic, that they forget it's a mask at all. They begin to believe that they are the persona, but the shadow, the repressed, silenced, and authentic part of them does not disappear. It waits in the wings of the psyche, and it inevitably seeps through the cracks of the mask, often in the form of a chronic, low-grade bitterness that taints everything. This bitterness often hides behind a convincing smile. A parent may lovingly cook meals, offer advice, and play the part of the devoted caregiver, all while harboring a deeply buried resentment for the personal sacrifices they feel were never truly seen or thanked for. A professional may lead meetings with impressive charm and wit, all while nursing a bitter, secret belief that their true talents have been consistently overlooked and undervalued. A spouse might play the role of the loyal, supportive partner for decades, all while slowly eroding on the inside because of the personal dreams they gave up for the sake of the relationship. In each of these cases, the persona successfully maintains a socially acceptable image, but the soul suffers in silence. Jung saw this dynamic as one of the great tragedies of modern life. The more a person identifies with their persona, the less they know their true self. And in that ever-widening gap of disconnection, bitterness flourishes. It flourishes because while the persona might win praise, promotions, and respect, it can never, ever satisfy the deeper longings of the soul. The mask may fit society perfectly, but it doesn't fit the self. This is precisely why people often find themselves saying, with genuine confusion, "I don't know why I'm so unhappy. I have everything I'm supposed to want." They have the family, the career, the circle of friends. They post smiling pictures on social media. They say all the right things at dinner parties, but underneath it all, they feel empty, cynical, and emotionally numb. That is the calling card of the persona trap. It is the deep, aching pain of living a life that has been scripted for social approval rather than one that is rooted in personal authenticity. Bitterness thrives in this internal environment because the person is fundamentally split in two. On the outside, they perform their role flawlessly. On the inside, they quietly deteriorate. And because they are so deeply committed to maintaining the persona, they feel completely unable to confess their true, messy emotions. They fear being judged, misunderstood, or, worst of all, being seen as weak, ungrateful, or negative. So they keep pretending, and the longer the gap between their inner truth and their outer performance, the more corrosive and deeply rooted the bitterness becomes. This psychological split also creates what Jung called a neurosis, a disease of the soul caused by the persistent refusal to live in alignment with one's deeper nature. The bitter person often begins to experience chronic fatigue, persistent irritability, emotional numbness, and even physical symptoms like tension, headaches, digestive issues, or insomnia. They may find themselves lashing out in passive-aggressive ways, subtly sabotaging their own relationships, or suddenly wanting to quit their jobs, not because they consciously want to cause chaos, but because the psychic pressure of wearing the mask has become unbearable. The persona is not just a defense. Over time, it becomes a prison. When overused, it protects, yes, but it also isolates. People who live exclusively behind a mask often feel profoundly and achingly lonely. No one knows the real them. Their friends know the role. Their colleagues know the act. But their rich inner world, raw, tender, and hurting, remains completely hidden. And after years of hiding, They start to believe that maybe that inner self isn't worth sharing, that it's unlovable. So they shrink, quietly, into the cold comfort of their bitterness. To escape this trap, Jung encouraged a lifelong process he called individuation. Individuation is the courageous journey of integrating the persona, the shadow, and the true self into a unified, authentic whole. It means consciously stepping away from the desperate need to be seen in a certain way, and instead cultivating the courage to simply be. For the bitter person, this means daring to say the terrifying words, "I'm not okay." It means allowing the mask to slip, even just a little, and letting trusted others witness the raw, unfiltered self beneath. It means reclaiming all the emotions that were buried in the psychic basement to keep the persona intact. This is a terrifying prospect for many people, especially for those whose entire identity is built around being the strong one, the responsible one, or the nice one. Letting go of the persona can feel like a total loss of control, but Jung believed that what we often think is control is actually a form of chronic self-abandonment. We meticulously control the outer image, but completely lose the inner essence, and that trade-off over time is the very recipe for bitterness. Healing begins with unflinchingly honest reflection. It requires asking the difficult questions. What part of my true self have I hidden away in order to be accepted or loved? Where in my life am I performing instead of showing up authentically? Who in my life knows the real me, and who only knows the role I play? These questions are not just philosophical exercises. They are psychological lifelines. They help us trace the origin of our bitterness not to the actions of others, but to the small and large moments where we betrayed ourselves for the sake of social approval. That initial betrayal may have been a necessary survival strategy at the time, but if we want to find peace now, that pattern of self-abandonment must be reversed. One of the most difficult aspects of this process is confronting the grief. When we begin to peel away the layers of the persona, we often find a younger, more vulnerable version of ourselves underneath, a version that gave up on dreams, silenced desires, and amputated parts of its personality just to be loved, to fit in, or to keep the peace. That younger self is often full of a deep, profound sadness, and that sadness must be felt. Jung believed that bitterness is often just frozen grief, the tears that were never shed, the pain that was never named. These are the seeds of the cynicism that people carry decades later. And then there's the anger. The bitter person may have never been allowed to be angry. Maybe they were told that anger was wrong, disrespectful, or dangerous. So they learned to swallow it, to smile through their righteous rage. But anger that is denied doesn't vanish, it gets redirected. It turns into sarcasm, withdrawal, contempt, and passive aggression. And the longer it simmers beneath the surface, the more it becomes indistinguishable from the person's core identity. Jung didn't pathologize these so-called dark emotions. He believed that all feelings are essential messengers for psychological wholeness. What damages us is not the emotion itself, but our refusal to feel it. The persona says, "I'm fine." The shadow whispers, "I'm not." Bitterness is the painful, static, filled noise that arises when those two voices are never allowed to be reconciled. This profound internal tension often explodes in midlife, a period Jung poetically called the noon of life. Around this time, many people start to feel deeply disillusioned. The roles they've played for decades no longer satisfy them. The achievements that once felt so important now feel hollow. They may experience what society dismissively calls a midlife crisis. But Jung saw it as a sacred and necessary threshold. a precious opportunity for the soul to demand that we turn inward and finally ask, what in my life is actually mine, and what have I just been performing for others? For those living in the grip of bitterness, this threshold can be both terrifying and incredibly liberating. It is their chance to finally break free from the prison of the persona and begin the journey home to themselves.